Nyajong Tuling Tutu. Today, I'll be bringing you on the journey on how I realized I also became another one of my participants in my study, and through that, how I finally accepted my identity as a first-generation born Hmong-American. So how did it all start? Well, in high school, I actually used to ask myself, Jess, are you a Hmong person or are you a white person? Considering that I hung out with a lot of white people growing up, I wanted to identify like them too. Until I started to dive deeper into my roots. As I sat in my AP United States history class, we started to talk about the Vietnam War. Now, I got really excited at this point because this war was better known to me as the Secret War. For those of you who are unaware of what this war was, it was a time when the CIA needed help to fight against the communists, North Vietnamese, and Pathet Lao. So what they did was they recruited a young Hmong boy by the name of Vang Pao. Vang Pao became the general for the Hmong people and helped the CIA recruit other younger boys and men to help fight in the war. But as we all know, the United States lost and they fled, which left my people behind to be abused in unimaginable ways. Those of us who were lucky enough to cross the Mekong River got to fly to the United States as refugees around 1975. Those of us who didn't get to go right away ended up in the refugee camps in Thailand, awaiting our departure to the United States. Those of us who weren't so lucky are still in the jungles today, thinking that the war is still going on. So going back to the time when I thought I was going to learn about this for the very first time, I raised my hand with all of the anxiety building up inside of me, and I asked my teacher, so how about the Secret War? And to my amazement, she responded with, oh, we don't talk about that. I was livid. How come we only got about 3 lines in our history lesson and in our textbook and nothing more? So I went to search for the answers about my history and about my identity. And the only answers that I could find that were accessible to me were living and breathing at home, my family. So I stopped searching until I got to college, and I asked, will college have the answers to my identity, and will it help me find those answers? Again, I just shrugged my shoulders, and I said, you know what, forget it. I don't think my education was going to have those answers for me. Until, for the 3rd time, through my independent research, I got to ask these questions again as I reflected about the time when I was searching for my identity in high school, and through the interviews, surveys, and multiple focus groups I conducted with my participants. Now, before I move on and talk about my research, I just want to disclose that I'll be saying Hmong-identified to try to stay true to those students who identified as being Hmong but had different identifying factors for themselves. And a couple of those examples are included here on this slide. So as the first part of my study begins, I start by collecting experiences and stories of Hmong-identified students. And after completing this first step, this is what I realized about us as a collective of Hmong people. That we have the biggest number of Hmong residents right here in St. Paul, Minnesota, with a rising number of 29,000 plus residents, with Wausau, Wisconsin sitting next in line to Sacramento, Fresno, California, and so many more states and countries. We're a diaspora. Not only that, since our time here in the United States, we have flourished with our beautiful song poetry, dance, cultures, traditions, and everyone's favorite, food. But most importantly, the migration has led us to be a part of Congress, having our own schools, our own nonprofits, to being our own doctors, and our own flea markets down the street, Hmong Town or Hmong Village. So you could see that we've been successful in participating in our communities and also have been given diverse opportunities like higher education. So how were we doing in higher ed? That was a question I had for myself during my research. So as I tried to mold my thesis together, no one's favorite part of a paper or research, I started to reflect upon, in college, How come there were only going to be a handful of us who were going to graduate compared to how many of us Hmong-identified students were enrolled? So I did some digging, and I found that the recent graduating class, there were only about 45% Hmong students who graduated compared to how many were enrolled. Now, I also found that that was going to be possible for my graduating class this year, and probably for the ones coming up next. So then I zoned in on my thesis and my research on truly understanding what success really meant to the Hmong-identified students, and if graduating was really one of them. So we go in, and I start to think about what I'm supposed to do next. So I found a national data and report for enrollment rates and graduation rates for all students. So moving on to the data, I found that in 2017, it reports between 1990 and 2015 that the enrollment rates for white students was around 69%. And the enrollment rates for Asian students was not indicated until 2005 when the data was available. And it indicates that for Asian students, they were enrolling at the highest rate for any race or ethnicity at 87%, excuse me. They also reported how consistent students were enrolling between 2010 and 2014. And it indicates that white students were enrolling at a lower rate than before at 57%. And for Asian students, 6%. Now, I want to also bring your attention to the enrollment rates for Asian ethnic student groups. They report that in 2014, all Asian students were enrolling at 65%. And when we're looking at the ethnic groups for the South Asian students, Chinese students were enrolling at the highest at 76%. And for your Hmong-identified students, who are a part of the Southeast Asian student ethnic group, they were enrolling at a middle to low range of 43%. Now moving on to the graduation rates. It reports from cohorts starting from 2008, which is your graduating class of 2012. It then reports that for white students, they were graduating at a rate of 63%. And for Asian students, 71%. So some of you may be wondering, how does this make sense, right? I wanted to show if the enrollment rates were correlating with the graduation rates, specifically for Asian students. And it kind of looked like it did, right? But when looking at the Hmong-identified student enrollment rates and comparing that to what I found for my university, they weren't as similar as we saw for the national report. And you may wonder, how come those students at her university weren't graduating at that high rate that we saw today? Well, to use myself as an example, who my experience may not be universal among all Hmong-identified women students, but from my own experience, I felt like I was against the odds, and I had to fight against that. Because with all the pressures put on me, I had to graduate college and figure out how I was going to go into law school right away. Also, I had to know my roles as a Hmong daughter and a Hmong woman, as long as knowing her language, culture, and traditions. And lastly, I still had to figure out how I was going to be financially stable in the future so that I didn't have to worry about losing anything in the future, like how my parents and grandparents did after the war. So how did I really do it all? And how did I get the chance to be here today? Well, with the best support system that I could ever ask for, I got involved on campus with leadership opportunities with staff, students, and faculty. But I really have to credit the university's honors program, because without that determination to graduate with honors, I would have never done the research that I did today. But what was difficult throughout that process was getting out of the mentality of seeing myself as a student researcher, because I really couldn't, and I beat myself up on it. But with that determination and knowing that I had to graduate with honors by doing this research, I really wanted to do it. So I found the support who would help me through and see through my vision. And I got to be a part of Hamline's Summer Collaborative undergraduate research. And that made me feel truly blessed and truly thankful. So in my research, I reflected upon this instant and I wanted to see if other Hmong-identified students were also receiving this type of similar support. And the students indicated that their support came from on and off campus, from friends and family, and occasionally from staff and faculty and important resources. But most of the time, they were getting help and support from their friends. I also sent out a campus-wide survey to all students, staff, and faculty, and it's also reflected in the data for the support of these students. And so when we're looking at that, the data reports that for all students who responded, 71% of them knew who Hmong people were in general, whether that be on campus or off campus. And for staff and faculty and their survey, they indicated that they occasionally worked with these students, and that 10% of them had a high familiarity of who Hmong people were, and that 40% of them had a low familiarity. Now, among all survey participants, the most effective way of knowing anyone who was Hmong in general were through personal relationships. But where they were being seen the most was in the classroom. So you could see when, who, and where these students were getting their support from, through anyone that they had a relationship with. And most of the time, it wasn't indicated if that was with staff or faculty. So then I wanted to know from staff and faculty if they were using any critical theories or frameworks to help their students succeed. And only about 39% of them responded, and only a handful of them indicated an actual framework or theory that was relevant to cultural pedagogy or something similar in their respective field. So were they using their implicit biases and believing that all students were the same to help all these students succeed? I'll leave that for you to decide. So at this point in my research, this is what I started to realize about us as a collective again, of Hmong people, that we weren't being represented in the workplace, in the classrooms, in textbooks, or in movies, because representation was very limited. So I jumped ahead and I went and gave the university recommendations and suggestions. And my recommendations began with this, that they need to help the Hmong-identified students graduate, so we had Hmong professionals and artists in places like the workplace, the classroom, writing textbooks, and hopefully maybe in movies. And secondly, to support these students to see that they can achieve their dreams in whatever way they'd like, rather than seeing themselves as a stereotypical Asian student who just got all A's to become a doctor and engineer, because that wasn't universal for all of us. Because for me, I'm a legal studies student, nothing close to being a doctor or engineer. And my suggestions indicated this, that they need to keep ethnic studies and keep it as a high standard as they do STEM. And for their scholarship requirements to be more inclusive, or reforming that GPA requirement on those scholarships. And for their honors program to be inviting and obtainable for each student, and so that they understand that it's more than all about academics, and that it focuses on the student as a whole. And in hopes that the university understands that they can also try to achieve inclusivity, diversity, and equality, but most importantly, that they shouldn't treat all the students the same, because students like them and myself who have a dual identity struggle to find a place where we belong, especially in a place that systematically puts us in a spot to fail. But my suggestions don't stop there. My last one to the university was this, that the reliance on data and statistics doesn't show any adversities or any more about our experiences as children of immigrants and refugees, which holds us back a lot in this innovative world that we live in. So they need to start listening and taking care of their students so that they can be up ahead with their white peers who I compared them to earlier in the talk. Now at last, we come to my favorite part of my research, the interviews that I conducted earlier that I mentioned. The interviews that I conducted was to counter the dominant narratives about these students or the Asian students and to also show that even though the statistics that we saw today may have been daunting, there's more to the students and their stories and their path to success. And so I asked the students, what are some of the things that you would like the university to know about you to better understand who you are? And this is what some of them had to say. That they're a shy person who needs time to adjust and be comfortable in new environments with new people. That they're really quiet and it takes time for them to observe things around them, and that it's okay to approach them even if they do look intimidating. And that they would like to be pushed out of their comfort zone with all of the things that they have experienced. And as a first-generation student, to succeed in graduating and doing something their parents never got to do. So finally, at the end of my research journey, I realized that I fell into a deep depression. It wasn't until I got out of it where I realized that mental health and self-care needs to be talked about amongst various communities, but especially in the Hmong community, because it doesn't get talked about a lot, so that students in the future know how to take care of themselves in these type of predicaments. And so in the future, I hope that Hmong-identified students or other students don't have to find the answers to who they are and their identities through research or added resources, and that they can find it in accessible resources that will have the support system to be there to listen to them and understand them as each individual story to be told. Thank you.